We can stand.
Fine, we'll stand.
Okay, yeah, hi. It's great that you're all here this afternoon. I don't have to introduce Jillian, but I wanted to introduce the actual title of this talk because we just put in something very official to get our funding. The actual title is, we're talking about guns and boobs today. So why is this? I want to ask Jillian to introduce us to the issue of platforms. So what are platforms on the internet, and why do you think they might be a problem for freedom of expression?
Sure. So the premise of this is basically that all of the places in which we communicate online, so these major platforms, obviously there are other spaces as well, but Twitter, Facebook, Google, et cetera, are all private companies. And as such, being based in the US, they have First Amendment rights as well. So they have the right to censor you in any way that they want. And that's completely legitimate. And so now what I'm looking at is now that many of these sites have more than 1 billion users all over the world, they're basically basing their rules around the ideas of the founders of the companies or of the policy staff that work at these companies. And so I would call this sort of a kind of cultural imperialism where the moralistic values of Americans, mostly white men, are being imposed on all of the users around the world.
Okay, could you maybe elaborate on this by giving us maybe a few examples? So which issues are discussed on platforms, which might be seen as problematic by these white men who are in charge, and in which way do they actually censor these discussions?
Yeah, so the obvious example and why we're talking about guns and boobs is because historically Facebook, you might know this history of it, that a few years ago they were censoring or taking down any photo that depicted breastfeeding. At the same time, they allow a bunch of different violent content. And even a couple of years ago, before all of the discussion around ISIS or ISIL, whatever you want to call it, Facebook had actually come out with a statement in, I think, 2012, maybe earlier, that it was okay for them to show beheading videos. They've since changed this policy, but there's actually a statement from them from a couple of years ago that showing beheadings is perfectly acceptable, while at the same time, no nudity, no... there are a bunch of other rules as well. No hate speech, but they don't define what that is. And sometimes those rules come down really hard on activists in certain countries. And so I do think that this is sort of in line with American moral values, which is to say that, same on television in the US, you can't show nudity, but you can show violence, and often really gratuitous violence. And so I think that's really kind of the scope of the problem, that these rules are not in line with any sort of international law or any sort of standards around what is acceptable speech.
Yeah, but talking about acceptable speech, there are so many standards about acceptable expression online on this planet. So take, for example, Arab countries, they might have very strict rules on nudity as well, and they might have very strict rules on what can be said about religion, for example. In our Western countries, we have maybe completely different standards. So why does it make such a difference if private companies, as opposed to governments all around the world, set these standards and enforce them?
Well, because these are the places that we commonly connect online. We think of them as public spaces, even though they're not. And so I've called this kind of the quasi-public sphere, where, in a lot of places, and particularly for people who are not technical and who don't know these other spaces on the internet, Facebook is often the first point of connection. And even, I'm sure that this has been discussed at some other point or will be, but Facebook is now offering Facebook Zero. So you have, sort of a first line to connection completely in violation of the principles of net neutrality, where Facebook is the place that you can go first if you're in certain sub-Saharan African countries or other low internet penetration countries. And so I think that these really represent what would be historically the town square, or even the shopping mall is another good example of this, sort of a US example, but nonetheless.
And do you think that it's really a problem? Because everybody, many people are on Facebook, but it's not the only platform. And you can still set up your blog and have your friends comment on your blog, or you can try Google+, maybe. I don't know when you logged in back last time into Google+, but it's still on there, if I get it right. So maybe that's an option. So why is it such a problem if Facebook imposes certain values as long as there are alternatives to it?
Well, so I'd start and say that those alternatives, Google+ or Twitter, they censor too. And especially now, more recently, with the latest terrorism issues, these companies have now started actually consulting with European governments on how to censor proactively certain kinds of terrorist content, recruitment, and speech. But, okay, so let's argue for a minute that it's not a problem. Sure, you can just leave Facebook. I mean, how many people in this room are even on Facebook? Probably more than I expected, okay.
Many. Yeah.
All right, but you can leave, right? Sure, no problem, I can leave Facebook. What happens when I leave Facebook behind? Well, first, I'm leaving my network, so the people that I've met all over the world, the people that I connect with, but that's really a personal problem. I could get their email addresses or their phone numbers, and I could find other ways to talk to them. But at the same time, there are certain ways in which connecting through Facebook allows for political participation. So this is true in other parts of the world as well, but to give a US example of this, in 2012, President Obama did a virtual town hall, and this was hosted, I don't recall exactly how it worked, but you had to have a Facebook login to sign into this and to participate. Same with news sites. To comment on many news sites now, you have to have a Facebook account. Until recently, Spotify, you had to have a Facebook account. And so you're essentially cut off from participation and cut off from your network. And so while you can leave, you can't take your network with you.
So you're saying that basically Facebook is without real alternative, at least for certain aspects of communication online?
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of other ways that you can connect, and I encourage people to do that. I mean, I'm using Elo now, I'm on Diaspora, whatever, but at the same time, I don't have the same people on those platforms. And the thing about Facebook is that most governments don't block it. So if you're thinking about certain countries, Saudi Arabia is one of the examples given earlier, that's a site there that's still accessible despite all of the other censorship that goes on, and true elsewhere as well. And so because of the difficulty, the political difficulty in blocking Facebook, it's actually one way in which in some countries it's incredibly important for people to use that as their network.
So if you're critical about Facebook blocking certain content on the internet, would you rather advocate that Facebook just let everything pop up on their network?
Sort of. So I do think that, first off, these are American companies. And so I would prefer, generally speaking, that they uphold the standards that are ensconced in the First Amendment, or, barring that, under Article 19. But, I mean, we've talked about Facebook is required to censor in countries where it has staff on the ground, where it has servers. But at the same time, all of these companies, Twitter, Facebook, they go farther than that. So earlier this year, Twitter censored at the behest of a legal request from the Pakistani Telecommunications Authority. And what they were blocking was accounts of porn actresses, and I can't remember what the other one was, but I think it was something insulting the government. And so Twitter got this legal order, and they blocked these sites, and it turned out that the order was not actually legal. It wasn't done through proper channels. It wasn't, but Twitter didn't know that because they don't have the staff that are capable of analyzing all of these different global laws. Eventually, they pulled back on that one, but we still see this stuff happening all the time.
But would you say that there is any way to come to legitimate blocking decisions? I mean, if it's so hard to decide what should be blocked, like materially, maybe at least you could think of some kind of a process, some kind of a structure to come up with solutions. What is like really so bad that it may legally be or legitimately be blocked?
Well, so I think first it's worth looking at how these things get blocked in the first place. So if you're on Facebook, according to them, and I mean, I can't guarantee this, but according to them, they don't censor proactively. So the only ways in which they take content down is when another user reports them. So what this means is, to give an example, last month in the US, in San Francisco specifically, there were a number of drag performers who had their accounts taken down, about 40 people. And all of these people were performers who used their drag names in public life, but they had other legal names. So Facebook requires that you use your real name, which is a ridiculous concept anyway, but your legal name. And so what happened was these people had their accounts deactivated, and they were forced to submit or upload their identification proving who they were. And of course, the name on their ID did not match the name that they identify by. And so in this case, what you're looking at is a situation where someone actually went and reported all of those people. Now, what kind of incentive does a person have to report someone for using a fake name? Well, if the person's being abusive, then there are other ways that you can report them. If it's for harassment, then you click harassment. But if you want to report someone for using a fake name, you're probably doing that maliciously to begin with. You're the harasser in that case.
So you said in half sentence that real name policies are a problem. Many people see them in a very dark light for privacy reasons, but is there also a freedom of expression aspect to it, why real name policies are so bad?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think anonymity is an important cornerstone of freedom of expression. And so everyone should have the right to communicate anonymously. Now, again, these companies have the right to do whatever they want, and I acknowledge that. I'm not saying that this is legal censorship under the legal definition. But what it is like I've said, the network. And so if you want to use this anonymously, or if you're a trans person where your identification does not match your outside identity, or et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's so many examples: activists, domestic violence victims, or just anyone who wants to use a name that is not their legal birth name. I think that should be their right.
Getting back to your point that, for example, Facebook is more and more developing into some kind of a public sphere, and on the other hand, the reporting of content and the blocking decisions are just private events, private decisions that are taken inside Facebook. How would you suggest that this process might be improved, maybe even in some kind of democratic manner? Is there any way to think of a more transparent, more democratic process to take these decisions?
Yeah, so, okay, let's assume, for example, and I'm not sure I agree with this, but let's assume that we do believe that these companies have the right to regulate speech however they want to. And I mean, they do legally, again, I'll acknowledge that. First, I think that we need a complete overhauling of the rules. So what is or is not allowed should be in line with at least the standards or the principles of Article 19. So that's the first point. Things like nudity, that is acceptable speech. And then, obviously there are things that may not be acceptable speech. Harassment, for example. So that would be the first step. I think the second step is to overhaul these processes. The fact that I can just report someone for using a fake name when they're not doing any harm to me, I think that's really problematic. Whereas if someone is harassing me and Facebook wants to look into that, perhaps that is a better way that they could regulate speech. I'm not sure that I'm in line with that yet, but nevertheless, I think that those are the first two steps.
And do you see any way to really change Facebook in a more democratic way, really, like some kind of a way to represent users? I mean, blocking decisions are not the only really problematic decisions that Facebook has been taking, and if they are really developing into such an important actor in the public sphere, maybe we have to get some kind of user representation inside Facebook. Are you aware of any steps in that direction?
Yes. So there's 2 points here. One is, I wish I had the statistics on me, but I said this last week, and maybe somebody remembers. Facebook and Google and a couple of other companies have recently put out statistics on their hiring. So these are diversity reports, just like their transparency reports. And what they show is that basically almost 70%, I'm not getting the number exactly right, of the staff at these companies are white American men. I think that's the first problem. So they need to be considering different viewpoints, different ideas about what constitutes speech, and rather than bringing this sort of, again, cultural imperialism of this moralistic American viewpoint to their platforms. So I think that's the first step. On the second point, in terms of conversations with users, yes, I'm aware of them, and I think some of them are really good, and others are really problematic. So 2 examples here. One is that last year there was some controversy over the fact that Facebook, with these definitions of hate speech, so they say no hate speech is allowed on this platform, but a couple of feminist groups found that disproportionately they were allowing rape jokes and images depicting violence against women or making jokes about violence against women, while they were taking down other things that were racial speech, other things that would be constituted as hate speech. And so they've started talking with these groups, but as far as I understand from the groups that I've spoken to, they're still really unsatisfied with this process. At the same time, Facebook also holds special interest meetings with special interest groups, such as the Anti-Defamation League, which wouldn't necessarily be problematic, except that's a group that has pressured college campuses in the US to limit speech. So they're a pro-censorship group, essentially.
Okay, we've been talking quite a lot about Facebook. How about other public actors in this area? For example, Google or Twitter, even more less well-known companies. Are they maybe more advanced when it comes to integrating views from the public?
I'm not so sure. I think Google does try. They hold all of these meetings. They fund a bunch of civil society organizations, but I haven't felt particularly satisfied at this point that they're integrating all of these viewpoints. But to touch on another company, I know we talked about this briefly before. One of the other problems that I see, and one of the reasons that we called this Guns and Boobs, is that private cloud hosting services, in their efforts to eradicate child pornography, most of them, if you look at their terms of service, they actually ban nudity as well. So legitimate adult legal nudity. And so what this means, a couple of years ago, there was a good example from Microsoft SkyDrive, which I think has another name now. And they had kicked off a paid user, a paying customer, because he was hosting his art. And his art was just simple artistic nude images. And the reason for this is that they use photo DNA, which is not really capable yet of distinguishing between child pornography and other skin. And so essentially what this means is that there are becoming fewer and fewer spaces online where you can host these images, where you can host nudity. And so again, like for a non-technical user, I think that this is really important because you might not know how to set up a different kind of hosting service. You might not know how to do a backup. And I think that, obviously we can talk all day about the different problems inherent to that, but I think as long as people are using these services, they need to be much more considerate about what constitutes free expression.
But are there any examples of maybe models for user participation, or at least consultation with the opposite side? Because I had the opportunity to present before the Google Advisory Council on Tuesday, and one point that I thought was really important in the debate about the right to be forgotten, the so-called right to be forgotten, is that at least the publisher of the controversial information be heard before Google takes any decision this or that way about delisting of that URL, for example. So do you know of any example where such a process, like consulting with the other side, is already in place?
I think a lot of the processes are in place. I'm not sure how legitimate they are. So I think a lot of these processes that happen, and I'm not sure about that one, I wasn't there, but I think a lot of these processes that the companies are trying to undertake are essentially just ways of legitimizing their actions. So I haven't seen one yet that satisfies me. I haven't seen one yet where they've actually changed their terms or changed their procedures based on these conversations. Right now, from what I can see, it's just talk.
So at this point, we are at the stage where you can do some awareness raising, like today, and where we as a civil society can advocate more user participation in order to really transform these services into more public places.
Yeah, I think that that's what's necessary for now.
Thank you so much, Jillian. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you. You as well.